Welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're really plunging into a story of, well, unprecedented power, a massive scandal, and a downfall that just sent shockwaves way beyond Hollywood. When you hear the name Harvey Weinstein now, your mind probably goes to a pretty specific, somber place. But for decades, that name meant something totally different. It was synonymous with cinematic genius, success, the undisputed kingmaker of Hollywood. So our challenge today is really dissect this complex story, the people versus Harvey Weinstein. And we're not just going to tick off a list of, what he did, the alleged pattern of misconduct, the specific acts that led to convictions. That's part of it, sure. But our main mission here is to tell you the story. How did his decades-long abuse of power finally get exposed? Why did it persist for so long in the first place? How did the legal system finally respond? And maybe most importantly, what was the seismic ripple effect? How did this ignite a global movement? Basically, we want this to be your guide to understanding a really pivotal cultural moment, one that we're still feeling today.
Exactly. And we can do that because this deep dive, it's built entirely from some really exhaustive source material. We're drawing from The Fall of Harvey Weinstein, #MeToo Catalyst, and related pieces. This lets us give you a structured, factual, and hopefully a really insightful account. Every detail, every insight we're sharing, it comes directly from these thoroughly vetted sources.
Okay, let's dive in. To really get the scale of his eventual downfall, we first have to understand the sheer unchecked power Harvey Weinstein had for so long. He wasn't just a producer. The sources call him a kingmaker in Hollywood, co-founder of Miramax and the Weinstein Company. Immensely influential companies. This wasn't just about making movies, was it? It was about controlling careers, basically being the gatekeeper. What did that actually mean day to day, being a kingmaker?
Well, it meant exactly that, controlling the gate. Access. In one of the most competitive industries on Earth, think about it. Casting choices for huge films, getting the money for those prestigious indie projects, the distribution deals, international, domestic. And maybe the biggest one, orchestrating those intense, really complex Oscar campaigns. An actor gets cast in a Weinstein film, boom, potentially a household name overnight. A director gets their passion project greenlit. Suddenly, they're on the fast track. The sources are clear. Actors, directors, and entire studios depended on his influence. That's not an exaggeration. This was someone whose yes or no could literally make or break a career, launch you into superstardom, or just end it.
And the films themselves.
Yeah.
Wow. Shakespeare Love, Pulp Fiction, The King's Speech, Oscar winners, critically acclaimed. These weren't just box office hits. They were cultural landmarks. They defined eras, won the biggest awards. That success must have just cemented his status, created this sort of untouchable aura around him, didn't it?
Absolutely, it did. Those films validated his image as this, creative and business genius. The constant stream of awards, especially the Oscars, it just amplified his personal brand almost to mythic levels. It created this perception, both inside Hollywood and to the public, that he was just indispensable, essential. And that kind of consistent, high-profile success, well, it built this almost impenetrable fortress of power around him. Made it incredibly difficult for anyone to even think about challenging him, let alone actually try.
Yeah, it's hard to even wrap your head around challenging someone with that level of control, creative control, financial control, your whole professional life, your dreams, your income, potentially all in his hands. That kind of leverage is just immense.
Yeah.
And it definitely makes you wonder, knowing now about the whispers that existed for so long, how could anyone possibly speak up? What were the psychological implications there? What made that cycle of dependency so hard to break?
That's really the crux of it, isn't it? The sources paint a really stark picture. They talk about the whispers behind the glamour, whispers that went on for decades. And these weren't just vague rumors, they were specific stories. Closed-door hotel meetings, sudden career opportunities appearing or disappearing, women pressured into silence. Phew. When your entire professional identity, your ability to earn a living, is tied up with one person's goodwill, especially someone who controls so much, it creates this deep, profound fear. It wasn't just fear of missing a role, it was the fear of being blackballed, of having your reputation ruined, your livelihood just gone.
That dual nature of the fear he inspired, that's really chilling. People feared him not just because of what he could do for their careers, but what he could take away. That's such a powerful, insidious kind of threat, isn't it? Much more than just a missed opportunity.
It's a critical difference, yeah. The sources really emphasize that takeaway part was often more paralyzing. We're talking about the active destruction of a career, being labeled difficult, having projects mysteriously stall, getting smeared with rumors that make you untouchable. It wasn't just losing a chance, it felt like potential professional annihilation. And this whole environment, this fear and dependency, it allowed the alleged misconduct to just go on and on. It created this shield of silence around him for years. Victims felt isolated, like maybe it was just them, or that speaking out would only bring more ruin. His perceived power, reinforced by everyone else's silence, was a huge tool in maintaining that silence for decades, a massive barrier.
And that silence, like you said, it held for far too long. But then, almost overnight, it felt like, that quiet hum of whispers just exploded into this deafening roar.
Which brings us to Section 2, the tipping point. How did those private fears suddenly burst into global headlines and change absolutely everything? So, okay, the whispers were there for decades, a background noise under all the Hollywood glitz. But then, bam, October 2017, that quiet hum becomes this massive roar. Can you walk us through that specific moment, what finally broke through that wall of silence?
Yeah, the dam broke, as the sources say, October 2017. The New York Times and the New Yorker published explosive reports is the right word. What made this moment different, why it became such a flashpoint, was really a combination of things. First, the prominence of the accusers. Yes, there were whispers for years, but these reports featured courageous women, many of them famous, household names, going on the record. Their standing, their visibility. It cut through the noise in a way that anonymous stories just hadn't before. Right. It wasn't just who was speaking, but also how it was presented. The journalistic weight behind those reports was huge, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The credibility of the Times and the New Yorker was crucial. These weren't gossip columns. They were meticulously researched, cross-referenced, deeply reported investigations. Multiple sources often corroborating specific alleged incidents, some going back decades. That methodical approach gave the allegations this undeniable weight. It made it really hard for anyone to just dismiss them as isolated incidents or disgruntled people. This wasn't one or two voices. It was a documented pattern presented by incredibly respected news outlets.
You could almost feel the collective shock around the world. It wasn't just another story. It was this immediate realization of the sheer scale of the problem. And once those reports landed, it was like the floodgates just burst open. The sources say dozens of women came forward. And again, not just anonymous sources, prominent actresses. Ashley Judd, Gwyneth Paltrow, Angelina Jolie, Rose McGowan. Can you even imagine the courage it took for them? Women who had so much to potentially lose. Breaking years, sometimes decades, of silence against someone that powerful.
The courage really can't be overstated, no. These women, many with huge, hard-won careers, were putting everything on the line. Reputation, livelihood, everything. Their decision to speak out and to do it together created this powerful collective force. It turned those individual whispers into a chorus that Hollywood and the wider world just couldn't ignore anymore. Their bravery really paved the way for so many others, showing that maybe, finally, a collective voice could challenge that kind of entrenched power.
And what these dozens of women described was this chillingly consistent pattern. The sources are clear. Weinstein allegedly lured women into private meetings, coerced them, and then used his industry power to silence them. It wasn't random. It sounds disturbingly methodical. Can you elaborate on that pattern? What made it so effective for so long?
Yeah, the sources consistently describe this kind of playbook. It often started with the promise of a career opportunity, talking about a script, a casting meeting, maybe an invitation to a private event, often late, often in a hotel suite. Once they were isolated, the alleged coercion would begin, leveraging his power and their vulnerability. But the silencing part was just as crucial, just as methodical. That involved everything from, veiled threats, you'll never work in this town again, to aggressive lawyers, private investigators digging for dirt, and, maybe most infamously, the widespread use of non-disclosure agreements, NDAs.
Right, so these NDAs, they weren't just standard business contracts in this context, were they? They were used like a weapon.
Precisely. They were particularly insidious. The sources say they were used to legally gag victims, often tied to financial settlements, so essentially buying their silence and reinforcing it with the threat of ruinous legal action if they ever spoke out. Many women felt completely trapped. Take the money and stay silent, or speak out and risk career death and legal battles they couldn't possibly win. The systematic approach, combined with the isolation and his perceived invincibility, just built this fortress of silence that let the alleged abuse continue for decades. And that consistency, story after story hitting the same notes, that really strengthened the credibility of all the accusations.
And the scale, when it finally came out, staggering. The sources confirm. Over 80 women would eventually accuse Weinstein of misconduct ranging from harassment to rape, spanning nearly 30 years. 30 years. Just think about that timeline. How many lives impacted over such a huge stretch of time?
That duration, that sheer breadth of the alleged actions, it really highlights how systemic the problem was, how deeply entrenched this alleged behavior was in the industry. It wasn't just a blip, it was, as the charges later suggested, a pattern victims felt powerless against for almost 3 decades. And that long timeline with so many accusers, it made it impossible to dismiss these as just isolated incidents anymore.
And this is where it connects globally. The Weinstein case became the flashpoint for the global #MeToo movement. This wasn't just contained to Hollywood. It sparked this huge public conversation everywhere. But what was it about this case, this specific moment, that made it the undeniable catalyst for #MeToo? Why Weinstein?
That's a really crucial question. It was sort of a perfect storm. Like we said, the prominence of the accusers' famous faces gave it visibility. Then the journalistic rigor from the Times and New Yorker gave it undeniable credibility. It wasn't just accusations, it was documented patterns. And finally, I think the sheer flagrant abuse of power by someone right at the absolute top of his industry. It made the story universal. It resonated far beyond Hollywood because it exposed a system of silence and complicity that sadly felt familiar to people in many different workplaces. It struck a chord globally because it tapped into this deeply ingrained issue of power imbalance and abuse everywhere.
And the immediate impact was just massive. The case shattered the silence around workplace harassment and abuse of power. It gave this collective voice to countless survivors all over the world. It took something hidden and made it a global conversation, empowering people to share their own stories and demand change like never before.
Absolutely right. The sheer visibility of Weinstein's alleged actions and then the avalanche of accusations against him and other powerful men that followed, it made it impossible to keep ignoring sexual harassment and assault. It became a collective awakening, not just individual stories anymore. And it wasn't just anger, it became a strategic push for change, fundamentally shifting public discourse, forcing industries to confront their own roles and demanding real systemic changes.
So, the whispers had become roars. The dam had broken. The legal system finally had to step in. With all these allegations piling up, the public outrage, the wheels of justice slowly started turning. Which brings us straight to the huge New York trial in 2020. Okay, so the formal legal action kicks off in May 2018. Harvey Weinstein surrenders to authorities in New York, and the charges were serious right from the start. Rape, criminal sex act, sexual abuse, and sexual misconduct. These initial charges involved two specific women, Miriam Haley and Jessica Mann.
And right away, the legal battle lines were drawn. Starkly different strategies. The prosecution aimed to paint him as a predator who weaponized power. Their argument was he systematically used his influence to commit these alleged crimes, leveraging his position to coerce and then silence victims. The defense, on the other hand, argued forcefully for consensual encounters. They claimed the relationships might have been, transactional because of his status, but they weren't criminal. Their goal was to raise doubts about the accuser's credibility, their motives, a pretty standard defense tactic in these kinds of cases. It set the stage for a really high-stakes, incredibly emotional trial.
The trial itself gets underway January 2020 in Manhattan. Massive media attention, public focus. The courtroom atmosphere must have been unbelievably tense. The testimony, especially from the accusers, the sources describe it as emotional, detailed, and damning. You can almost feel the weight of those moments just reading about it.
Oh, absolutely. The human drama in that courtroom was intense. And this is where a really key legal element came into play, something called malnounou witnesses. This became a major point of contention. These were individuals allowed to testify about similar uncharged alleged acts by Weinstein. Now, legally, their testimony isn't supposed to prove he committed the charged crimes just because he might have committed others. The idea is to show a pattern, a modus operandi, maybe intent. It helps counter defense claims that the charged incidents were just accidents or misunderstandings or consensual.
Okay, so just to clarify, it wasn't about adding more charges in that trial, but more about painting a bigger picture of his alleged behavior. How did that work specifically here?
Exactly. The prosecutors used these Molyneux witnesses very effectively to establish a pattern of Weinstein's alleged assaults. For example, if multiple women described being lured to a hotel room, supposedly for business, and then facing similar types of alleged coercion, that consistency helped the jury see the main allegations weren't isolated incidents. It suggested they were part of a larger, systemic pattern directly challenging the defense's narrative of consensual or purely transactional encounters. It created this kind of signature of alleged behavior, making it harder for the jury to believe the specific charged incidents were just one-offs or misunderstandings. Now, the defense fought this tooth and nail, obviously. They argued this testimony was incredibly prejudicial, basically poisoning the jury against him by bringing in unproven allegations for crimes he wasn't formally charged with in that case. This whole fight over Molyneux testimony is really common and often central in sexual assault trials.
Got it. So it wasn't just about Miriam Haley and Jessica Mann's testimony. It was about showing this wider, consistent, alleged pattern that backed them up. It makes sense for the prosecution. And then February 2020, the verdict comes down in New York. He was convicted of criminal sexual act in the first degree against Miriam Haley. She was a production assistant assaulted back in 2006, and also convicted of rape in the third degree against Jessica Mann, an aspiring actress assaulted in 2013.
But, and this is important, he was acquitted of the most serious charges. Predatory sexual assault, those carried a potential life sentence. So it was a mixed verdict, a huge victory for the prosecution on 2 major felony counts, but not a complete sweep on everything they brought.
Exactly. It's complex, isn't it? A conviction, a clear finding of criminal behavior, a massive moment for the survivors, but not on the absolute top charges. What does that mixed result really mean, do you think? For the victims, for the public watching? It really makes you think about the legal system.
It absolutely does. It really underscores the challenges of prosecuting these kinds of cases, especially when they involve power dynamics and events from years, even decades earlier. While the convictions were monumental, showing even the most powerful could be held accountable, the acquittal on the predatory charges highlights just how high the legal bar is for the most severe convictions. Proving a pattern of predatory behavior beyond a reasonable doubt, enough for a potential life sentence, needs an incredible level of evidence and corroboration, especially for private events from the past. Even with strong Molyneux evidence, it just shows how meticulous and sometimes frustrating the justice system can be, even when public opinion feels overwhelmingly one way.
And then came the sentencing phase, March 2020. Weinstein gets its substantial sentence, 23 years in prison. And Judge James Burke, who presided, made a powerful statement, didn't he, noting that Weinstein's actions were part of a larger pattern of abuse.
Yes, and that sentencing phase also included incredibly powerful victim impact statements. During those moments, survivors like Miriam Haley and Jessica Mann spoke directly to the court, describing in painful detail years of trauma, fear, and career sabotage. These statements are just vital. They allow the real human cost of the crimes to be heard, loud and clear. They move beyond the legal jargon and show the deep, lasting damage psychological, emotional, professional inflicted on people. It's such an important part of the justice process, giving a voice back to those who were silenced and making sure the court fully weighs the real-world impact. They made justice feel incredibly personal and real.
Okay, so he gets the 23-year sentence in New York. But the legal story wasn't over, not by a long shot. Even while serving that time, he was facing new charges in a totally different jurisdiction. Which takes us to Section 4, the second conviction, the trial out in Los Angeles in 2022. It's pretty remarkable, really.
Yeah.
He's starting his New York sentence, and then the justice system reaches across the country. It really highlights the sheer scope of the allegations. He's indicted in California, Los Angeles specifically, on 7 counts of sexual assault involving multiple women. It just underscores this wasn't a one-off localized thing. It speaks to the breadth of the alleged behavior.
Absolutely. It showed the extensive nature of the allegations and the commitment of different legal systems to pursue justice for numerous alleged victims in different places. Even with the New York conviction, the alleged crimes in California were distinct incidents involving different women, allowing for completely separate legal proceedings. It demonstrated the alleged misconduct wasn't confined to one city or one group, reinforcing that pattern again.
And in December 2022, that LA verdict comes in. He's convicted again, this time for rape and sexual assault of an Italian model and actress. This related to an incident back in 2013 at a Beverly Hills hotel. So another conviction, another victim seeing some measure of justice, another layer of accountability.
And crucially, that conviction led to more prison time. In 2023, he got an additional 16-year sentence, and significantly, it was ordered to be served consecutively, meaning after his New York sentence is finished. So you add it up, that's a massive amount of prison time stretching decades into the future. It basically ensures he faces decades behind bars, likely the rest of his life. That consecutive sentencing sends a really strong message about accountability when multiple serious crimes are proven across different jurisdictions.
Right, so not concurrent, where they run at the same time, but back to back, adding up to nearly 40 years. That paints a very clear picture. But like you said, the story isn't totally closed, even now in 2025. Let's look at Section V, current status and ongoing appeals. Okay, so as of 2025, the sources confirm it. Harvey Weinstein remains incarcerated. He's in prison, serving the New York Times with the California sentence stacked up behind it. But of course, the legal system has appeals. That chapter is still playing out.
Yes, it is. He's actively appealing his cases. And what's particularly significant is that New York's highest court, the Court of Appeals, agreed back in April 2023 to actually review his conviction. His defense team is arguing a pretty common point in appeals, that the trial judge allowed prejudicial testimony.
Okay, so for listeners, what does prejudicial testimony mean here? And appeals, generally, they're not a redo of the trial facts, right? They don't redecide guilt or innocence.
That's a really important distinction. No, an appeal isn't a retrial of the facts. The appellate court doesn't look at the evidence again and say, did the jury get it right? Appeals focus purely on legal errors that might have happened during the trial process itself. Prejudicial testimony means evidence or testimony that, okay, maybe it was relevant somehow, but its potential to unfairly bias the jury against the defendant outweighed its actual informational value, possibly denying him a fair trial. In Weinstein's case, the defense is zeroing in on those Molyneux witnesses, the women who testified about alleged uncharged acts. They're arguing that testimony shouldn't have been allowed, that even if it was meant to show a pattern, it was just so inflammatory it unfairly prejudiced the jury against Weinstein on the actual charges he was facing. So they're arguing a procedural mistake, a legal error, not trying to re-argue the facts of the assaults themselves.
Got it. So even with these appeals happening, the overall outlook for Weinstein seems pretty bleak, doesn't it? The sources point out, despite the appeals, there are still decades of prison time hanging over him. It seems highly likely he'll spend the rest of his life locked up.
That's the overwhelming reality, yes. Appeals are a fundamental right, but overturning a conviction, especially on grounds like prejudicial testimony, it's a very high legal hurdle. Appellate courts are generally hesitant to overrule a trial judge's decisions on evidence, especially when there were multiple convictions based on significant testimony from many sources. Given the convictions in 2 states, the consecutive sentences adding up to nearly 40 years, the odds of these appeals drastically changing his long-term situation seem very, very low. It's effectively a life sentence. The process might seem slow, but it shows how meticulous the justice system tries to be, even in these huge, emotionally charged cases.
So we've tracked the man, his incredible power, the shocking downfall, the complex legal fights that followed. But this story is so much bigger than just him. The Weinstein case wasn't just about one person. It had this massive impact that's still reshaping industries, reshaping culture around the world. Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, the enduring legacy. Why does this story still matter so much? It's so important to stress this again. The Weinstein case was never just about one guy. The sources are really clear. It shifted an industry and a culture. And I want you listening to think about the implications way beyond Hollywood, beyond the red carpets. This reached into every workplace, every institution. It challenged norms that had just been accepted for way too long.
Absolutely. The revelations literally shattered the silence around workplace harassment and abuse of power. For decades, these issues were just swept under the rug, right? Dismissed as isolated things, handled quietly with NDAs. The Weinstein case blew the lid off that. It showed how fragile those silences were and exposed the systemic nature of the abuse. It forced a wider, much more public, much more honest conversation about what had been tolerated in workplaces for far too long. The sheer number of victims, their collective voice, it just made the issue impossible to hide anymore.
And it wasn't just talk. It fueled actual movements. The impact on #MeToo, on Time's Up, it's undeniable. They gained global traction, empowering survivors, and really forcing corporations to rethink accountability. This wasn't just a hashtag moment. It became this sustained drive for real change.
Exactly. Those movements cleverly used the intense spotlight on Weinstein to push for systemic change. They went beyond just naming names to demanding real institutional reforms. Suddenly, companies everywhere were scrambling to look at their HR policies, their recording systems, their whole internal culture. We saw it immediately in Hollywood, new codes of conduct, hotlines, but the ripple effect went so much wider. Laws were looked at again. Public conversation shifted completely. It became much harder for workplaces to just ignore or cover up harassment and abuse allegations. It wasn't just about Weinstein facing justice. It was about building a foundation for safer, more equitable workplaces for everyone. That collective power of survivors was unprecedented.
And that ripple effect was huge, leading to what the sources call a broader reckoning. It went way beyond Hollywood. Corporate America, politics, universities, sports, even restaurants leaders who seemed untouchable were suddenly under intense scrutiny.
We saw so many other powerful figures fall in the aftermath, didn't we? Their past actions suddenly viewed through this new lens of zero tolerance. That's probably one of the biggest, most lasting legacies. The Weinstein downfall proved that power could protect predators, but only for so long. It showed that even people at the very top with seemingly all the influence in the world could eventually be held accountable. It created this new expectation for transparency, for justice. It fundamentally challenged the idea that some people were just above consequence because of their status or money. It really shone a light on how complicity and silence were woven into so many industries, letting abuse thrive. But it also proved those systems could be broken down when enough people found the courage to speak out.
So wrapping up this section, the sources call the case a turning point, a public reckoning, and a permanent scar on the entertainment industry. It fundamentally changed how we perceive and confront power and abuse. It really did change everything.
Indeed, it's this stark, unforgettable reminder. The glamour can blind people, but the truth, especially when spoken collectively and backed by solid investigation, has this undeniable power. It forced Hollywood into some serious self-reflection, leading to significant, though definitely still ongoing, efforts to create safer, more accountable workplaces.
Wow. What an incredible, devastating, and ultimately transformative story this has been to unpack. We went from Harvey Weinstein, the Hollywood kingmaker, seemed totally untouchable, to his double convictions in New York and L.A., facing decades in prison. And we've seen how his case wasn't just about the law. It was the spark that ignited these huge cultural shifts that are still playing out globally, changing how we think about power, abuse, and accountability. But as we finish this deep dive, I want to leave you with one last thing to think about, sort of a provocative thought. What do these ongoing appeals, the legal technicalities, and those decades of prison time facing Harvey Weinstein, what do they really represent? Not just for him, but for how society understands justice and accountability now. How does this case keep reminding us that we need constant vigilance, sustained courage, and a real commitment to holding power accountable if we want to dismantle systems of abuse, wherever they are? And what does it tell us about that long, often incredibly difficult, but vital road to justice for survivors, and the collective strength it takes to walk that road? What does that permanent scar on the entertainment industry really tell us about how power is used now, and more importantly, how it can be challenged not just in Hollywood, but in any industry, any part of life? Definitely something to mull over long after this deep dive ends.